Resource Management at the Business School at Manchester Metropolitan University, and I'm joined by my colleague Sarah, who has her camera on. Do you want to give us a wave, Sarah? Sarah Acton, when we both worked on the project and the findings we're talking about today. So Sarah worked more on the first part of the findings, I worked more on the second part, so I'm going to cover all of it just for ease, but both of us will be able to deal with questions and comments. So we are going to talk about the Good Employment Learning Lab, and that's a project that we have run. We've finished delivery now. We've almost finished the project actually, about creating good employment. And one of the labs within the Good Employment Learning Lab was the Adult Social Care Learning Lab. So we've done lots of work with adult social care managers around various things. And we're going to talk particularly about learning today in the lab, and we're going to talk about values-based recruitment. Hang on. So, quick overview. This is the lab that I've just talked about. We had our learning interventions, as we called them, and we'll reflect on those in the next little while. So we did 2-hour interactive masterclasses. We did peer learning sessions. So there were 3 peer learning sessions, 2 or 3 weeks apart, of a couple of hours each. And we did 3 coaching sessions. So they were 1-to-1 with a coach, again 3 a few weeks apart, of a couple of hours each. And one of the things that we were interested in is this idea of what works for whom and why. So kind of a realist approach, thinking not everything will work for everybody all the time. So let's try and think about what does work, where it works, when it works, and why. And that's been a key strand of the work that we've done. So we've completed delivery, as I say, we're doing the analysis, and these are our early findings. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the learning, but I'm also going to talk about the topics, only one of them, and here values-based recruitment. So those interventions, we ran them for values-based recruitment, for voice, conflict and creativity, and for getting the best out of your people. And in the next sort of month, 6 weeks, we'll be publishing our report. So if you're interested in any of those, there will be material available for you to have a look at. And we designed around 5 learning pillars. Now, I'm not quite sure of the balance of my audience between HR people and non-HR people, but even if you're not an HR person, hopefully in terms of helping your people learn, this will be of interest to you. And we focused on designing our interventions so that helped people to gain knowledge, which was an obvious one. Most things do that. But then we thought about, well, how do we help people both gain that knowledge and then do something useful with it? So we worked in a reflective mode, getting people to think about their practice, particularly in peer review and coaching, but to think about their practice and how they could change their practice. We helped them to make sense of it. The peer review, for example, there were sessions where they could discuss with people with similar challenges, possibly not in the same role as them, but similar challenges, how to make sense of things. One of the things that we really wanted to do was to get people to experiment. We wanted to create change so that people didn't just come on the learning and then hopefully enjoy it, which the feedback suggests that they did, but they go away and do something different. And I'm not going to show you our theory of change, but I'm going to show you some of the outcomes that we theorised might happen and how successful we were in getting that experimentation and getting that change. Because one of the things we were really keen on is that our work made a difference, and managers felt they had the knowledge and the skills and were empowered to go and do things that created different ways of practice, and that they did that together, learning together. That was a key part of our work. Ooh, and we've got it. So I liked knowing, yeah, so we tried not to be overly theoretical, but we were always research informed. So here we have a manager saying, I liked what was in an official definition. So they kind of got the sense that our work was evidence-based and research underpinned, and that gave them again confidence, which I'll talk about quite a lot, about going out and making change and using the learning from the sessions. Here, keener to experiment, sense of peer learning, again confidence and that feeling of support, learn from others and their challenges, think about things in a different way, and that made me more receptive and more open to learning. So these are quotes from the interviews we did with managers after they'd engaged in the interventions to try and find out what had happened, and lots of really powerful quotes about the difference that this had made. So I've talked about confidence, and that came out as really, really key in our work. So we were trying to build manager confidence in people management, and that sense, isn't it, that line management is complex and highly skilled and deals with a whole range of different issues, and line managers can often be overwhelmed by that, and particularly their people management challenges. So this idea of creating good employment was, how do we help line managers develop those skills and confidence to be good people managers, to create good employment? And they told us that their confidence grew from the fact they gained knowledge, reflected and made sense. So our learning pillars really emerged from the evidence that we gathered, and also from being supported to identify what's going well and how to experiment. And certainly in our peer review and our coaching, we created a lot of space to have those discussions. But even in the masterclasses, there were always breakout sessions and a chance for interactions to learn from each other. Line managers told us that helped to reduce their isolation and give them reassurance that their challenges, they weren't alone in facing those, that others also very much face those challenges. One of the things we were really interested in was that line managers went away and used the techniques that they'd worked with. So where they had been to coaching sessions, for example, they often went away and tried to coach their teams. Where they'd been to peer review sessions, some of them tried to set up peer review networks. So as well as the kind of the specific knowledge, those techniques we worked with them on, they took away and used. We did use terms that ultimately we understood, came to understand. We needed to define better. People perhaps didn't understand masterclass, peer learning and coaching. So that was a lesson to us about being clear around that. And some of the data I'll show you shortly, it was interesting that this idea of masterclasses being a gateway. So the knowledge we gave in masterclasses was important to help peer review and coaching to work and be successful. And at the end, we were generally successful in getting people to experiment and to learn. So we'll again show you some data on that. And people became more reflective and more thoughtful. And that was interesting to see as the sessions developed and people brought their challenges back and came back and talked about what they'd done and what they'd learned. So what did we think? What did we learn about designing our programs? Well, we delivered, I should have said this at the beginning probably, but when we started, we were intending to do everything face to face, and then COVID struck. And we delayed for a little while our project, and then we decided, you know what, we're just going to have to get on with this. And we did everything online during a period of COVID. So that was really quite challenging. And we had various ways of recruiting people. Probably haven't got time to go into all those now, but if you are in a situation where you're trying to get managers to come along, we're happy to talk about some of the things that we did, because originally getting that traction was really difficult. And so we kind of learned some different skills and mechanisms for picking that up. Time is the primary barrier. So whatever we design has to reflect that. So at the beginning, we had quite lengthy peer review sessions, and we found people just couldn't make enough time for those. So we reduced each peer review session to encourage people to have the time to come along for that. So this kind of idea of timeliness was really important. Managers really valued learning events, this kind of time out and a specified time out to have that learning. So this idea of asynchronous learning, so pick up e-learning at your own time, can be really valuable, but was less valuable in what we did. People wanted to come along, even if it was online, not face to face, at a specific time and interact with others. And that was really important. And then one of the things that we also found was really important was the fact that our peer review and our coaching sessions were delivered by skilled HR people. So Sarah being one of those and Liz Rivers being the other. And that idea of not just having a coach, but having a coach who was skilled in HR emerged as really important, because people brought their challenges and they were quite tricky. And actually, the skills of coaching themselves were really important. But again, that knowledge input and that discipline input was also really important. So what are we recommending? So when you design programs, you think about this intentional design, the learning pillars, that we talked about, that there's time and space between the events so that people can experiment and come back and talk about that experimentation, and the learning from that experimentation was really, really valuable. We had a resource bank, a curated resource bank, where we gave people access to structured materials and sessions so that they could explore again some of the ideas that we talked about that might be unfamiliar to them, to find out new things about that. We mixed learner cohorts from departments, experience and sectors to make sure we got this really rich blend of people coming together. And again, this idea of the skilled facilitator, there's lots in there we could spend a lot of time on, and I don't have time to, this idea of being a role model, having expertise, and then something that came across really, really strongly was the idea of psychological safety, a space where we can try out our ideas and our thoughts, but equally what we were encouraging people to do was go back to their workplaces and set up their spaces of psychological safety for their colleagues in doing these things differently. And then again, I've got some data on this in a moment, but providing foundational knowledge. So masterclasses gave the basic level of knowledge, certainly for inexperienced managers, for them to be able to do really well in coaching and peer learning. So we had a theory of change, and what we were trying to do was deliver learning, get people to experiment, change their practice, and then other positive outcomes will result. So this is our initial analysis of the managers who came along and who've either taken part in an interview, filled in a diary, filled in a survey as to what happened, what was their learning journey. So you can see that over 90% felt that they had gained knowledge, and 85% committed to experiment. And as you might expect, as we get further and further along the process, the numbers fall. But nevertheless, even by the end of the process, we've got some quite encouraging data. So just slightly over 70% of managers felt that improved their practice. Now, this is all practices, not just values-based recruitment, but even so, you can see that's quite powerful in creating change, because often people come to masterclasses, enjoy it, go away, and don't really do very much different. So our kind of approach of getting that commitment to experiment, and then this kind of accountability, we went back to them, we interviewed them, we asked them what they'd done, and again, that sense that following up and having accountability did also create that change. Some managers went on to improve organisational practice. That depended very much on their remit, their level of seniority, the level of empowerment they felt. Although interestingly, some managers came along, went back and tried to change organisational practice and felt that they weren't empowered enough to do that, and on a couple of occasions made them think, actually, the values of this organisation are not mine, and moved on. So again, some kind of powerful outcomes in that sense. Quite high level, well, reasonable levels, 30% felt that there were positive impacts on staff. So we'll talk a bit more about that when we get onto values-based recruitment, but some of the changes that we brought about meant staff working experiences were improved. So where we help people to manage conflict, where we help them to be more creative, for example, that created a better working experience. And that's one of the things, this idea of good employment, that we were really interested in. And then ultimately, a sense that good and productive work occurred. So, for example, that you might improve retention, people might stay longer because they were happier in the workplace, or they might be more productive, they were working better and more effectively. You might reduce absence, so if you improve, if you manage conflict better, for example, you might reduce absence. So we had quite a lot of powerful evidence that across our different outcomes, helping people to learn in the ways that I've described, created some positive change and some positive outcomes. So that's been a really powerful message from our research. So how did we develop creativity? Well, confidence was one of the things that came up again, confidence was one of the things that came up again and again. I've picked up new skills to confidently recruit staff who have the values and skills I'm looking for. active listening and reflecting rather than jumping in. And again, we heard that a lot, that managers perhaps had felt as a manager it was their job to solve problems, and actually we help them understand that sometimes standing back and helping others to solve those problems can be really powerful. So I don't jump straight to doing, and maybe that even made me seem more caring. Structuring one-to-ones and team meetings, asking open questions, trying to work out what the root of the conflict was. And then here I talked about some positive outcomes at organisational level, big improvements in productivity. I would relate these to methods of management. So managers, not always, I showed you those figures, not always, but often felt more confident, could change their own practice, sometimes could change organisational practice, and then could reflect on and identify the benefits, both for staff and for the organisation. So that, I think, is, yeah, so that's how we learned, how we help people to learn. And now in more detail, I'm going to talk about values-based recruitment. And our take on values-based recruitment was that it's about helping the individual and the organisation align their values and making sure that that is the case during the recruitment process. And this idea of values-based recruitment has been around not quite 10 years, but coming up for 10 years, because it came out of the Francis report, which you'll probably remember looked at some of the issues that had happened in mid-staffs and some of the care concerns or care quality concerns that came out of that. So the Francis report recommended values-based recruitment as a way to change culture and improve standards of care. So that's kind of the aim that underpins it. Now, in the healthcare sector, it's been fairly widely taken up, although I'll say a little bit more about that as we go through. It's been being promoted for a number of years now in adult social care, and Skills for Care have a lot of information and support around how to introduce values-based recruitment. But when we designed our project, we talked to stakeholders, we talked to Health and Social Care Partnership, local care organisation and other stakeholders, and this idea of recruitment was really important because, of course, there's always recruitment challenges in social care, but not just recruitment, but how do we get the right people? So not just anybody, but the right people. And that led us to this idea of focusing on values-based recruitment. It focuses on the how and the why an applicant makes choices in work, and how their attitudes, motives and values influence their behaviour. But this alignment between those and the organisation, as I say, is really important. So we think about the right people, right place, right thing, right way, and recruiting for values and training for skills. And that's kind of one of those things that can have a big implication in social care, in that often it is values and experience as opposed to qualifications that can make the difference between someone being a good carer and somebody being a less good carer. So this idea of recruiting for values and training for skills is important. And although we're talking about values-based recruitment, one of the things that we identified in our work is it actually goes way beyond recruitment. So actually a lot of your HR processes need to change to reflect the values that you are trying to embed. So it starts right back when you advertise, for example, even before you get to the interview, but it also goes on beyond that. So the induction, you are embedding people into an organisation that is reflecting the values you have used to recruit. They are evident in your training, in your leadership, in your supervisions, so that across a whole range of processes, having recruited someone for these values, you then enact them across the organisation. And the people we work with told us that, you know, that could bring about the need for quite big change that was really quite far reaching. But they also told us that when that happened and was done right, there was some really positive benefits from that culturally, and for example from retention, employee retention, people staying longer. So if you are interested in the detail of how to do values-based recruitment, we do have stuff and material in our resource bank that I referenced earlier, but you'll also find lots of really detailed material on the Skills for Care website. So these are pros and cons that came out of our work with managers. We might have picked these up when we were coaching or when we were in peer review sessions. They might have filled diaries or surveys in, and for quite a significant number of the people who came on the training, over 50 people, we held an interview and asked them what they thought, how it had gone, had they benefited. Some said they had lower recruitment costs. So that was to do with recruiting more effectively and not having to continually recruit. So that reduced recruitment costs and therefore this positive return on investment, because sometimes there was an upfront investment needed in recruitment. So you might change your interview questions, you might change your actual mechanisms. So you might hold group interviews or do scenarios rather than a straightforward interview. You might do different ways of recruitment. We probably say this somewhere else, but I'll say it when I'm talking about it. But actually, that was perhaps one of the difficulties, that values-based recruitment is often linked to quite sophisticated recruitment processes that you might, for example, expect to find in the NHS. But actually in social care, small social care organisations, you might not actually often get those sophisticated processes. So there could be an upfront investment which ultimately would reduce recruitment costs, but initially had to be found. But managers certainly felt that staff turnover was reduced. So where they were recruiting people who did have the values and fit the values, those people tended to stay longer. Many said it was low cost to introduce, but I have just said that sometimes slightly more sophisticated methods were used, and those people who fit the organisation better performed better. So all those things you might expect, we got lots of evidence of, and a really also strong sense, to go back to this idea of recruiting for values and training for skills, that it opened up the labour pool. So lots of recruitment and retention difficulties in social care. And actually, once we started to think about values and move beyond some of the other things we'd always looked for, there were bigger pools of recruits and people were more attracted to the jobs because of the values that were specified. So lots of really positive things came out, but there were downsides. So it took quite a lot of time to research processes that worked, that would help you identify values. I talk about this a little bit in the next one, but some organisations already had established values and that helped, but many didn't, particularly against small social care organisations. So there was a kind of whole process of needing to think about what those values were and articulate those values. So that again could be complex and time consuming. And then lots of changes to policies and procedures. I've taught, websites and induction and performance management processes and supervision. So it became quite wide ranging, so powerful, but not to be engaged in lightly without having thought through lots of the different challenges. And then candidate success is enhanced but not guaranteed. So we had some lovely quotes that we might have a slide in a moment or two, I'm not sure about, from managers who sort of said, these people we probably wouldn't have identified or selected using our more traditional techniques, where we ask them to talk about their understanding of care quality conventions and those kinds of things, because if you haven't worked in the sector before, you don't understand those things. But where we asked them to talk about their values and they told us their stories, we got to know them as a person, and we could see those skills and those experiences and those values they would bring. So it wasn't guaranteed still, but we got higher rates of candidate success because we were looking for different things, but things that were arguably more important. So that was really powerful. So what did our research show us? So it can contribute to decent and productive work because it supports performance management, creates a team identity and improves retention. And this team identity was really powerful, because if you are getting like-minded people with similar values together, then of course you can see how they will fit well as a team and work well together as a team, and a sense that that was enhanced by getting people in who shared the same values. Again, it gave you a performance management tool. We had managers talk about being able to challenge particular behaviours and say, you know, these are our values, because they were now explicit and we'd recruited to those values. Being able to challenge and say, you know, why are we behaving in these ways? Perhaps with each other, perhaps in teams, perhaps with people who we were providing care to, but having that mechanism to open up those conversations that perhaps had been more difficult to do before. One of the things that we were really interested in, our starting point was to try to train people in how to do values-based recruitment. And actually that was quite a lesson for us, that lots of managers were very unclear how to do recruitment at all. So it was kind of a piece of work that Sarah and Liz did, actually fairly quickly upskilling people in recruitment processes more generally. This idea of an accidental line manager, people would say, well, you know, I acted up for a while and then I was made permanent, or I came into it by a different route but not a traditional route, and I just completely missed recruitment and recruitment training. And so kind of an assumption on our part that line managers would be well trained in how to recruit people was flawed. So that's kind of perhaps something for you to think about with your teams, and particularly if you're in an HR role. Do our people have the skills that we think they have? So we kind of did a back to basics on recruitment before then actually moving into values-based recruitment itself. But again, that whole kind of learning and sharing with peers was really important. Something that's come out of our work that we think is really important, and I'll pick up over a couple of slides, is this idea of, if you're going to successfully implement it, you have to connect the organisational values to the experience of the staff and the people receiving care. So go beyond the recruitment process. But we were really struck in talking to managers who recognised or articulated a disconnect between the values that we were espousing, so dignity and care, for example, that we were wanting workers, care workers, to demonstrate to those they cared for, but the values and managers felt care workers were subject to, if you like. And I come on to it a bit in the next slide and some of the reasons for that. But this idea of a disconnect, so we expected one set of values to be applied to those receiving care, but those values were often not extended to care workers themselves. And that disconnect was seen to be problematic. And some of that some of the contextual pressures were also really important. So we did do this during COVID. So there were lots of pressures in the sector. You work in the sector, I don't need to tell you that. But workload and short staffing could make successful implementation challenging. Getting the headspace to stand back and do some of these things might save you time in the long run if you're recruiting well and not then having on a perpetual cycle of recruitment. But that upfront investment for busy managers in a time of crisis was often very difficult, very challenging. So, I mean, we use some theories that you may or may not be particularly interested in, but this idea of people fitting well into the organisation and sharing the organisation's values. So kind of technically it was person, organisation fit and value congruence. So with this idea, we want to recruit people who fit into the organisation. So managers were very positive about that. But one of the things that they wrestled with often in masterclasses, peer learning and coaching was this idea of values. So what values should we have? So the healthcare sector establishes a set of values. Now there might be challenges around the extent to which they're lived, but they are specified. That isn't the case in social care. We also worked with managers who came, for example, from local authorities, where again there were local authority-wide values, but they weren't necessarily always wholly applicable to social care. Some of them would be, but some of them would be more general and not necessarily care focused, because the local authority has a wider remit. So it's this idea of what values do we adopt? So values exist across the whole organisation, which may not relate in a meaningful way to care. And actually, if we haven't, you know, for a small firm and we haven't got values established, how do we go about that? Well, so sometimes inherently, implicitly, we might know what we think our values are. But again, that can be quite a big piece of work in establishing those, because they have to be real. So whoever runs the organisation has to then work with, for example, existing staff and existing people using their care services to make sure that what they're saying actually is experienced. So it's a valid and genuine process of recruitment to values that once somebody joins, they will experience. Because if they join and don't experience those, they will very quickly leave again. So somebody did say, well, we've got our values. You're interviewing. It's not just about whether they've got the physical, mental, intellectual capacity. It's how they're going to go about doing that job. Their day-to-day way of thinking. Do they fit? Will they be good for that person? So that it kind of opened up a different way of thinking about how we interview and how we work with people in the recruitment process. So it could be effective in increasing this person-organisational fit. And theoretically, if that happens, we've got better performance and we've got better retention. This idea also of signalling theory. So value-based recruitment gives you the opportunity, a mechanism through which to share explicitly those values. So in the recruitment process, the candidates were asked to share their personal and professional values, and the organisation shared it. So you've got this kind of two-way discussion of what is important, what is valued. And again, that could attract candidates to the organisation where values were explicit and chimes with an individual's values. That was really powerful. I've talked about recruitment already. But again, to go back to this idea of establishing values and how well known these values are. So even where values were established, there was quite a sense that they weren't always embedded. So some local authorities, for example, had established values. They were on lanyards and mugs in the office. You know, that's a quote from one of our participants, but they weren't. There was not a strong sense of feeling that they were really lived values. And so again, there was kind of questions about the genuineness of that, sincerity of it, how meaningful that was. But again, an example of in the interview, how it changed. It needed to be more of a story. Questions that explore the right connections, not just questions and answers. Values, principles, personality type, etc. should be some of the things that you're asking for, rather than just direct business questions. And for many, this was a revelation. And I said they changed their interview questions, they changed their techniques, they used different ways of getting people to interact. They might have group interviews, so you could see whether people did treat other people in the way that they were suggesting they did, and not just telling you things perhaps that you wanted to hear. I'm not sure we do have this on the slide actually, but one of the things that interviewing managers did say was that it could be quite skilled for managers themselves to do values-based recruitment, but equally it could require quite a lot of skill from the candidates. And so there was sometimes a piece of work to do with candidates to help them understand what you were asking, because they were very different questions to those that you might typically have experienced in interviews. So kind of a shift for them as well, and some support needed sometimes, helping them understand that before you could get into kind of having the conversations that you might need to have. And then this is the point I was making earlier in more detail about this idea of making sure that the values we ask care workers to show to the people they care for are experienced by care workers. And often there was a sense that that wasn't the case, and that wasn't, I should sort of stress that that wasn't necessarily to do with the organisations not having the kind of right values. It was more to do with contextual conditions. So living the values, we were asking for people to show care, compassion and dignity, but care workers or managers felt that care workers often didn't receive that themselves. And the examples they gave for that were the low pay they received, the difficult conditions that they worked in, the stress they worked under, with sometimes limited support, often on 0 hours contracts. So there's this real sense of, we want care workers to exhibit dignity and care for those people. Of course we do, but actually the employment experience of care workers is often not dignified and often doesn't feel caring. So that was something that came out quite a lot, and we thought was really interesting, how do you wrestle with the disconnect between those two different sets of experiences. They often don't have a strong and enduring relationship, often a very high stress context. So that really challenges those values that the organisation's trying to embed in good faith, but in quite a challenging wider context, that might make it difficult. The other thing that came out was a reliance on agency staff. And again, given recruitment and retention difficulties, and particularly during COVID phase, the managers we work with suggested they had quite often used agency staff, a very high reliance on agency staff, and a sense that actually they're fairly transient, they come and they go, and that trying to engage them with organisational values was a very difficult thing to do, and certainly recruiting them on the basis of organisational values was really challenging and unlikely to happen, essentially. But where it did go well, we've got here this idea of team fit and team identity. Newer members of staff kept saying to me, "This is such a great team to be part of. Everyone supports each other. It doesn't matter who you go to, you're going to get support and you're going to get help." There were lots of challenges and lots of concerns, but also lots of positives that came through. So what are our conclusions around this? Well, I think one of our conclusions was that I talked earlier about healthcare and values-based recruitment being introduced in healthcare, and that adult social care had kind of followed that path, which is sensible, and you can see why that might happen. But the principles in healthcare of the kind of sector-wide care, sector-wide values being established, perhaps the more slightly sophisticated recruitment processes, perhaps some more highly skilled line managers, some of those principles that are required for values-based recruitment to be successful, perhaps lacking in social care. Although some of the people we talked to suggested they weren't necessarily always to be found in healthcare. So I think at the end we say our findings might have wider relevance. So some of these issues that we found about kind of disconnecting organisational values, for example, that might also be in healthcare, or at least in certain pockets of healthcare. We can see that it will improve organisational fit, person-organisation fit in certain conditions, but that becomes challenging when people are employed on insecure, fragmented contracts, which is often the case, and that shared understanding of values, that shared experience of values is then lacking. I think one of our messages back from this, and we are obviously sharing our findings here and with policymakers more generally, is that manager training is really valuable and really helpful, but that can't alone resolve this. There are these wider system-wide challenges so that caregiving organisations can employ people in ways that afford them the values that they then are required to go on or encouraged to go on and demonstrate in their care, so that this idea of dignity and support and secure employment is really important, underpinning those values and creating that employment experience that means people will be well positioned to go out and care for people using those values. It takes time to implement. which could be a barrier, particularly given urgencies in filling vacancies. So it needs to be quite well thought through. There needs to be this kind of system-wide, organisational-wide shift to embed it more widely, and that can take some time. And we felt, of the managers we worked with felt that the training had been very valuable, the experiences, so that kind of experimenting, changing practice, some of those outcomes had been very valuable. But the wider context that they were doing that within wasn't always sufficiently supportive. So the sector has a way to go in making it successful and needs to address some of those wider issues. And we picked up through our work that might also be the case in health and indeed other sectors. So one of our key messages is that if we're using values-based recruitment, we have to be really clear that the values apply to staff as well as the people being cared for, and you really need that connection to make the whole thing come together and be successful. So I know we need time for questions. So we could. I think we're going to circulate these slides. So we've put some links at the end, and I think Sarah's been fielding questions in the chat about support and resource that we can offer. I don't know if Sophie, are you going to field questions, or if you want me to?
No, yeah, it's just open. If anyone has any questions, you just pop your hand up, and yeah, I'll stop recording now. So
I'll stop sharing as well, and then